This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. This definition of love, then, is the true and ultimate expression of love. It's the one that Jesus showed us as he laid down his life for us. Sometimes an event becomes so familiar to us that it no longer impacts us. Every now and then I get in a mood to kind of go and look at YouTube videos of events. Like sometimes I'll watch some of the footage of 9/11, 2001. And even now when I go back and I really watch them and maybe I can really give attention to them, it's almost as if I'm back in that day when I first found out living in Oklahoma. And the emotions all kind of flood back into my heart, and I begin to kind of breathe fast, and my heart beats quickly. And I remember how emotional I was on that day and how the whole country came together and was impacted by that event. If we aren't careful, the events of the cross, which at one time moved us and touched us deeply, emotionally, will become just a list of events. This happened, this happened, this happened. And that raw emotion, that magnitude of suffering, the depth of Jesus' love is lost. Or maybe even the man Jesus is lost. He's lost in the details. He's lost in the schedule of events. I invite you today to give yourself permission to experience the depth of Jesus' love, the breadth of his suffering, and the intensity of his cross. It may not be easy because the story is so familiar. But please, let's not let familiarity cause us to lose a greater understanding of what true love is. And that is that Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. And we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers. Let's keep our eyes focused on Jesus. So I invite you to push out the thoughts that cloud and compete for your attention today, and to truly focus on and to relive the events of Jesus and his cross. So with that introduction, let's go to John chapter 19, which is where we are in our study of the book of John. I'm going to be using one of the older versions of the New International Version today. John chapter 19, beginning in verse 1. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in purple and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, O King of the Jews!" And they struck him in the face. Once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priests and the officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify." But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." But the Jews insisted. "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You have no power over me that was not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jews kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar's. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at the place known as the Stone Pavement. It was the day of preparation of the Passover week, about the 6th hour. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, "Take him away, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. And finally Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus. Carrying his own cross, he went to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. And here they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on either side of Jesus, and Jesus in the middle. Pilate had a notice prepared and fashioned to the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the sign was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. The chief priests of the Jews protested to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but that this man claimed to be the King of the Jews." Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." When the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes, dividing them into 4 shares, one for each of them, with the undergarments remaining. This garment was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. "Let's not tear it," they said to one another. "Let's decide by lot who will get it." This happened that the scripture might be fulfilled, which said, "They divided my garments among themselves and cast lots for my clothing." So this is what the soldiers did. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary of Magdala. When Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Here is your son," and to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that time on, this disciple took her into his home. Now, I've told you this event I'm about to tell you before several times. But at my mother's funeral, John Dale, who did that part of the funeral service in Paris, Tennessee, told of a childhood memory of his concerning my mother. He was at the movie theater with some friends. One of them was my mother. They were watching the movie called The Robe. And The Robe is about the crucifixion of Jesus. And he said that he sat there and remembered my 15-year-old mother weeping during the crucifixion of Jesus. I didn't know it until her death that this had happened, but he revealed it to us at the funeral. It's a precious memory for me, because the cross of Jesus is something to weep about. The emotion of the cross is worth experiencing. Because Jesus suffered and died on the cross because of my sin and yours. And he suffered willingly and with joy. But mark my words, it was very real suffering. Painful. Humiliating. Excruciating. We're going to use this as our outline today. Some of them this morning, some this evening. Suffering. Here is the man. Crowds. What I've written, I've written. Garments. Tonight we will look at Mother, it is finished. Blood and bones, and Joseph and Nicodemus. First, suffering. Chapter 19 opens simply with these words: Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. In verse 3, they went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him in the face. One, a great physical human suffering, flogging, and the other, a great human indignity of being slapped in the face. Both painful in their own way. Here begins then the suffering of Jesus. As Isaiah prophesied in Isaiah 53, surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. That's mine and that's yours. Consider some of the indignities that Jesus suffered. He was slapped. There's hardly anything that would make a person bristle than to have their face slapped. Flogged or scourged. The King James Version uses it. We'll look at that in a moment. Ridiculed. Matthew tells us he was spat upon. The Gospels tell us he wore a crown of thorns. He was crowned with thorns. Next slide. One of the other Gospels tells us he was blindfolded and then slapped and said, "Who hit you? You're someone special. You tell us who slapped you." Hit on the head with a staff. Stripped of his clothing. There's a great embarrassment to be unclothed publicly before crowds of people. Dressed in purple and mocked, and had his hands bound. It is the beginning of the mystery of passion, where intense suffering culminating in death purchases our eternal life. A cruel death is the price of this gift. And the fact that Jesus was willing to pay it is the most amazing expression of love imaginable. So don't discount Jesus was flogged, because many people died from flogging. Flogging was in and of itself a form of intense abuse. Flogging is whipping the back with a strap containing jagged bits of metal or bone. Its purpose is to cause great amount of physical suffering and pain and physical damage to the body. It often rendered the victim unconscious due to the intense pain. Add to this the mockery, the slaps, the spittle, and it equals one of the most heinous cruelties possible. Jesus suffered. He did it for me. He did it for you. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for me. Number 2. Here is the man. When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." And as soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify." But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify it. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." There's been a lot of artwork throughout the last 2,000 years. Ecce homo, which is Latin for behold the man. I'll show you a couple of them throughout this lesson this morning. Here's one, a beautiful one. Here is the man. Every person must decide what he will do with Jesus. Here is the man, Pilate says. Every person must decide what he will do with Jesus. Believe him, ignore him, obey him, ridicule him. Every person must decide, what will you do with Jesus? Here's another piece of artwork from 1896. here is the man. And one more from the 17th century. What will you do with Jesus? You must decide. That's right. Number 3, crowds. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." And once the Jewish leaders stir up the crowd, they all joined in. Now, as you know, I've been doing some study in counseling and psychology, so I thought it would be interesting to just look up one study that was done on crowd dynamics. A study was done about applause. Have you ever applauded something you weren't enthusiastic about, but you just joined in because the crowd kind of started applauding and you felt obligated to join in? There's a real social dynamic to that. I've done it a lot of times. Where because one person started clapping and it kind of ripples and you're thinking, oh, I don't really want to, but then it kind of fills the whole room. It wasn't even that great what you were clapping at. But you did it because everybody else was. And then there's an equal pressure socially to keep on clapping until someone decides it's time to stop. So everybody keeps clapping until somebody decides it's time to stop, and then it kind of just tapers off. There's a real psychology to that. It comes from this social pressure to start clapping, but once you started, there's an equally strong social pressure not to stop until someone initiates that stopping. Someone here, scribes and Pharisees, energize the crowd in this crowd dynamic. The whole crowd was chanting, demanding for Jesus to be crucified, instigated by the scribes and Pharisees. Crowds can be dangerous, can be controlled and manipulated. Hitler knew this and exploited it, notably. Look at the crowds here. Think of the millions who died for him and his heinous causes. The power of the crowd. Mark tells us in Mark 15:11, but the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. Beware the crowd. Beware the pressure of the crowd. The pressure of the crowd can make even Christian people do things they wouldn't even consider doing. On one side, there is the indignity and the mockery and the dishonoring and the abuse and the sacrilege. But consider on the other side stands the man who is the Son of the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. This man, the Son of God, Jesus, being mocked, dishonored, and abused, and indignified. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. Number 4, what I have written, I have written. The chief priests of the Jews protested to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but that this man claimed to be the King of the Jews." And Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." It's interesting to me that finally Pilate gets a backbone, but it's just a little too late. John tells us very clearly here, from that point on, Pilate began to work the crowd to try to release Jesus. He was trying to release Jesus. But the crowd dynamic prevailed, instigated by the scribes and Pharisees, instigated by Satan and darkness. one spark of authority from Pilate when in fact it was too late to change anything. It's as if Pilate was saying, leave me alone, I've done this to appease you, now go away. Perhaps an ounce of courage that came too late. What I've written, I've written. But what he wrote was true. Jesus really is the King of the Jews, King of Kings. Number 5, garments. When the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes, dividing them into 4 shares, one for each of them, with the undergarment remaining. This garment was seamless, woven in one piece, from top to bottom. Let's not tear it, they said to one another. Let's decide by a lot who will get it. This happened that the scripture might be fulfilled, that said, they divided my clothes among them and cast lots for my garments. So this is what the soldiers did. John mentions the clothing of Jesus as a part of his thesis to prove that Jesus is the Son of God as confirmed by Old Testament prophecy. John draws attention to that Old Testament prophecy. Additionally, John was at the cross and would have seen these events unfold before his very eyes. And we'll discuss that some in tonight's lesson. All 4 Gospels mention the 4-man detail of soldiers, Matthew 27, Mark 15, Luke 23, and John 19. In light of the customs and culture of the times, it's reasonable to believe that Jesus was wearing 5 articles of clothing. It would have been a typical Jewish man's garments. A turban, a belt, a cloak, sandals, and an undergarment. 1 piece of clothing for each of the 4 guards, with 1 piece remaining. A seamless, apparently beautiful, perhaps valuable undergarment. His undergarment was a seamless, one-piece tunic. Some have suggested in history that it may have been supplied by Mary, his mother, who made it for him. But at any rate, they cast lots for this garment. The spoils of the dying men on the cross belonged to the guards who executed them. Here in fulfillment of Old Testament scripture, this undergarment, this seamless garment Jesus was wearing, they gambled for. So if he had on 5 pieces of clothing, and 1 was given to each of the 4, and the 5th piece was gambled for, what was left for Jesus to be wearing while he was on the cross? Jesus Christ laid down his life to show us what love is. Tonight we will consider Jesus' mother, it is finished, blood and bones, and Joseph and Nicodemus. But this morning I want to remind you that every person must decide what to do with Jesus. Here is the man. What will you do with Jesus? It is my prayer that today, that at least in some way, your heart has been touched emotionally, at least a little bit. That the emotions of the cross have had an impact again upon our hearts. That the man Jesus has been glorified in our hearts. That he has not been lost in the details. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. If the message of Jesus has touched you today and you'd like to respond, please do so as we stand and sing to you.